The phone rang at 2:14 a.m. It was not loud, it did not scream. It vibrated once against the wooden nightstand, a dry, restrained sound, almost polite. Yet it shattered something invisible in the room, something fragile that had been holding Daniel Carter's life together without his knowledge. He woke instantly, not startled, not confused, awake in the way a soldier wakes on a battlefield, already braced for impact. The room was dark, but the darkness felt heavier than usual, as if it had weight, as if it were pressing down on his chest. The digital clock glowed red beside the bed. 2:14. He stared at it for a second longer than necessary, as though the numbers might rearrange themselves into something less final. The phone vibrated again. Daniel reached for it with a hand that felt unfamiliar, like it belonged to someone else. His fingers hesitated just before touching the screen. A single thought crossed his mind, uninvited and sharp. If I answer this, everything changes. He answered anyway. Mr. Carter? Yes. His voice sounded hollow, unfinished. This is St. Anne's Hospital. I'm calling about your wife, Rebecca Carter. Time did something strange then. It did not stop. It stretched, thin and elastic, pulling each word apart, forcing Daniel to hear them too clearly, too slowly. There was an accident on Highway 7, the voice continued, calm and trained. A collision involving a delivery truck. Emergency services brought her in about 40 minutes ago. Daniel sat up in bed. The room swayed slightly, like a boat loosening from its anchor. Is she awake? He asked. There was a pause, brief, professional, deadly. I'm very sorry, Mr. Carter. The words did not land immediately. They hovered between them, suspended in the air. I don't understand, Daniel said. She was just going to pick up her sister from the airport. Another pause. She sustained severe internal injuries. The medical team did everything they could. Daniel swung his legs over the side of the bed, his feet touching the cold floor. His mind searched desperately for something, anything to hold on to. A detail, a correction, a mistake. She can't be gone, he said quietly. We prayed tonight. The voice on the phone softened, but it did not change the truth. I'm so sorry. The call ended, or maybe Daniel ended it. He was never certain. He remained sitting on the edge of the bed, phone still pressed to his ear, listening to the absence of sound. The silence was louder than the ringing had been. It filled the room, climbed the walls, settled into his lungs. Rebecca was dead. The words formed in his mind, stark and cruel, refusing to soften themselves. Rebecca was dead. He did not cry. He did not scream. His body did nothing dramatic, nothing cinematic. Instead, something inside him folded inward, like a star collapsing under its own weight. On the wall across from the bed hung a framed verse they had chosen together years ago, back when faith had felt solid and promises had seemed trustworthy. The Lord is close to the brokenhearted. Daniel stared at it, waiting for something to happen. Nothing did. The drive to the hospital passed in fragments. Red lights, empty streets, the faint hum of the engine. Daniel did not remember turning the key or pulling out of the driveway. His hands moved on their own, trained by habit and shock. The world outside seemed indecently normal. Streetlights glowed. A convenience store stood open, fluorescent and indifferent. Somewhere, someone was buying coffee. Somewhere, life was continuing without permission. At a stoplight, Daniel's hands began to shake. God, he whispered, the words slipping out automatically, like muscle memory. Please. He did not finish the sentence. He did not know how. When he arrived, the hospital doors slid open with a quiet hiss. The air inside smelled like antiseptic and something faintly metallic. A nurse approached him before he could speak. "Mr. Carter?" He nodded. She led him down a corridor that felt far too long. His shoes echoed against the floor, each step too loud, too present. At the end, they stopped in front of a small room. The nurse placed a hand gently on his arm. "I'm very sorry," she said, and opened the door. Rebecca lay on the bed, impossibly still. Her hair was brushed back just as she liked it. Her face looked peaceful, in a way that felt like betrayal. Daniel stood frozen at the doorway, his mind rejecting what his eyes were seeing. This was not how it was supposed to end. They had argued that morning. Nothing dramatic, just a sharp exchange over breakfast. Missed calls, unfinished plans, exhaustion that had been building for months. "You're never really here anymore," she had said, stirring her coffee too hard. "I'm doing my best," he had replied, already glancing at his phone. "Your best feels very far away." He had kissed her cheek before she left, quick, distracted. "Drive safe," he had said. Now she lay silent, and the words echoed back at him with unbearable clarity. Drive safe. Daniel approached the bed slowly. His knees threatened to give way, but he forced himself forward. He reached out and took her hand. It was cold. The reality of it pierced him then, not as a wave, but as a blade. Clean, precise, final. "I'm here," he whispered absurdly. "I'm here." His chest tightened. His breath came shallow. Still, no tears came. A doctor spoke softly behind him, explaining procedures, next steps, words that slid past Daniel without meaning. All he could see was Rebecca's ring, still on her finger, the one he had slipped on years ago with trembling hands and reckless hope. "Till death do us part." The phrase surfaced uninvited. So this was death, not dramatic, not poetic, just quiet, unforgiving, permanent. The days that followed blurred together, stitched by exhaustion and disbelief. The funeral was held under a grey sky that refused to break. People came, friends, church members, co-workers, offering condolences wrapped in scripture and well-meaning phrases. "She's with the Lord now. God has a purpose. He won't give you more than you can bear." Daniel nodded at the appropriate moments. He shook hands. He hugged people he barely felt. Inside, something curdled with every word. If God had a purpose, Daniel could not see it. If this was what he could bear, then God had overestimated him. At night, the house felt cavernous. Rebecca's presence lingered in small, cruel ways. The extra toothbrush, the indentation on her pillow, the faint scent of her shampoo in the bathroom. Daniel stopped sleeping. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying the last weeks of their life together with merciless precision. Missed dinners, half-listened conversations, prayers spoken out of routine rather than hunger. They had prayed together the night she died. He remembered it clearly now. They had stood in the kitchen, hands joined, heads bowed. Rebecca had prayed first, her voice steady, thanking God for protection, for provision, for their marriage, even strained as it was. Daniel had followed with familiar phrases, words learned over years of church attendance. "Lord, watch over us, be with us, Amen." It had felt sufficient then. Now it felt like a lie. On the third night after the funeral, Daniel found himself standing in the living room, staring at the small wooden cross on the wall. He had hung it there years ago, when faith had felt like home. "You were supposed to protect her," he said aloud. The words sounded foreign in the empty room. He waited for guilt to strike him, for fear, for lightning, for divine correction. Nothing happened. The silence answered him again. Daniel sank onto the couch, burying his face in his hands. His shoulders shook, finally, with something close to grief. "I believed you," he whispered. "I trusted you." The cross remained still, unresponsive, wood and shadow. That night, something subtle but irreversible began to fracture inside him. Not belief, at least not yet. Trust. Weeks passed. Then months. Daniel returned to work, moved through routines, spoke when spoken to. People praised his strength, his composure. "You're handling this so well," they said. They did not see the way he avoided prayer, the way scripture now felt like a foreign language, the way worship songs made his chest tighten with anger rather than comfort. He still attended church, out of habit more than conviction. He sat in the back, listening to sermons about hope and restoration, his jaw clenched. One Sunday, the pastor spoke about unanswered prayers. "Sometimes," he said gently, "God is still working, even when we cannot see it." Daniel stood up and left before the service ended. In the parking lot, the wind cut sharply against his face. He leaned against his car, breath visible in the cold air. "I don't see you," he said under his breath. "I don't feel you, and I don't trust you anymore." The words frightened him, not because they felt wrong, but because they felt true. And somewhere deep inside, a question began to form, quiet, dangerous, persistent. What if God had been listening and still said no? The thought settled into him like a seed, and it would not stay buried. Daniel stopped opening the mail sometime in November. The envelopes accumulated on the narrow table by the front door, white, brown, official, personal, stacking themselves into a quiet monument of avoidance. Bills, sympathy cards, church newsletters, handwritten notes from people who still believed words could reach him. Most nights, he stepped over them without looking. The house had learned Rebecca's absence faster than he had. The refrigerator stayed full longer. The laundry basket filled slower. Silence settled into corners that had once held laughter, arguments, the low hum of shared life. Daniel moved through the rooms like a guest who had overstayed his welcome. In the mornings, he drank his coffee standing up. Sitting at the table felt too deliberate, too much like admitting he was still alive. He avoided the bedroom until exhaustion forced him there. When he finally lay down, he kept to his side of the bed, as if Rebecca might still claim the other half by some quiet miracle. She never did. Sleep came in fragments, short, shallow intervals broken by dreams that felt more like interrogations than rest. In them, Rebecca was always present, but unreachable. She stood at the end of hallways, behind glass, across crowded rooms. She spoke, but he could never hear her. He always woke before she turned around. One evening, as winter pressed against the windows, Daniel found himself standing in the garage, staring at a box he had avoided for weeks. Rebecca's things, the ones people hadn't known what to do with, the ones no one had wanted to touch. He crouched slowly, his knees protesting, and opened the lid. A scarf lay folded on top, blue, soft, frayed at one edge. He picked it up and pressed it to his face before he could stop himself. The scent was faint now, but unmistakable. His chest tightened. "Stop," he muttered, more command than plea, and dropped the scarf back into the box. Underneath were notebooks, old planners, receipts, small, ordinary artifacts of a life that had ended without warning or permission. Then he saw it. A leather-bound journal tucked beneath the rest, dark brown, worn. The edges softened by use. Daniel frowned. He did not recognize it. Rebecca had kept journals before, years earlier, but she had stopped, or so he thought. He hesitated, fingers hovering above the cover. This felt intrusive, and yet a quiet urgency pushed against his reluctance, as if the journal itself were waiting. He opened it. The first pages were unremarkable, lists, thoughts, fragments of prayers. Rebecca's handwriting curved across the paper, familiar and suddenly unbearable. "Lord, help me be patient. I'm tired, but I know you are faithful. Teach me how to love well, even when it hurts." Daniel swallowed. He turned the page, and then another. As he read, something shifted. The tone changed, not dramatically, but unmistakably. The entries grew longer, heavier. Daniel feels far away again. I don't know how to reach him anymore. I keep praying, but sometimes it feels like I'm praying alone. Daniel's breath caught, He sank onto the cold concrete floor, the journal resting open in his hands. His eyes moved faster now, consuming words he had never been meant to see. I love him so much. But love doesn't always feel like enough. He listens, but he doesn't hear me. I wonder if he knows how lonely I feel sitting right next to him, his stomach twisted. This was not grief anymore. This was confrontation. Entry after entry unfolded a version of their marriage Daniel had refused to examine. A quiet erosion, slow and subtle, masked by routine and faith and the illusion of stability. I don't want to nag. I don't want to complain. I just want to be seen. Daniel closed the journal abruptly, his heart pounding. "No," he whispered. "No." He pressed his back against the wall, the cold seeping through his jacket, anchoring him in the moment. His mind reeled, scrambling for defenses, explanations. "We were fine. Everyone struggles. She never said it was this bad," but even as the thoughts surfaced, they collapsed under the weight of her words. She had said it. He just hadn't listened. That night, Daniel dreamed of the kitchen. Rebecca stood at the counter, stirring her coffee the way she used to when she was nervous, too hard, too fast. The spoon clinked against the mug, over and over. "Say something," she said without turning around. "I didn't know," Daniel replied. His voice sounded distant, like it was traveling through water. "You didn't ask." She finally faced him. Her expression was not angry. That was worse. "I waited," she said softly. "I waited for you to notice." He reached for her, but the space between them stretched, elastic and unforgiving. The kitchen lights dimmed, her figure blurred. "I prayed," she continued. "I asked God to wake you up." Daniel woke with a sharp inhale, his heart racing. The bed beside him was empty. He sat up and pressed his hands against his face, the weight of the dream lingering like a bruise. For the first time since the accident, tears came. Not sudden, not violent, but steady and relentless. They slipped down his face unchecked, soaking into the pillow. "I didn't know," he whispered into the darkness. "I didn't know." But even as he said it, another truth rose quietly to challenge him. You knew enough. Enough to ask. Enough to slow down. Enough to choose presence over distraction. He had chosen otherwise. Daniel stopped going to church entirely after that. It wasn't a decision, he announced. He simply didn't go. Sunday mornings became indistinguishable from every other morning. Gray, quiet, hollow. Faith, once a steady undercurrent, had become a source of irritation. Scripture verses resurfaced in his mind uninvited, and each one felt like an accusation. Love is patient. Love is kind. Had he been either? Prayer felt impossible. Not because he didn't know the words, but because the words felt dishonest now. How could he pray to a God who had listened to Rebecca's pleas and still allowed her to die before anything changed? How could he pray when the silence that followed felt intentional? One evening, his sister-in-law, Miriam, showed up unannounced. She stood at the door with red-rimmed eyes and a hesitant smile that didn't quite settle. "I was in the neighborhood," she said. Daniel knew that wasn't true. "She lived across town." "Come in," he replied, stepping aside. They sat in the living room, the distance between them awkward and loaded. Miriam glanced around, taking in the untouched decor, the absence that clung to everything. "She loved this place," Miriam said softly. Daniel nodded. "She worried about you," Miriam added after a pause. His jaw tightened. "She told me once," Miriam continued carefully, "that she felt like she was losing you." The words struck harder coming from someone else. "I didn't mean to," Daniel said, his voice defensive despite himself. "I was just busy. Life gets busy." Miriam looked at him then, really looked at him, not with accusation, with grief. Busy isn't the same as absent, she said quietly. The silence that followed was thick and uncomfortable. I prayed with her, Miriam went on. A lot near the end. She didn't doubt God, Daniel. She doubted whether you still needed her. The statement landed with surgical precision. Daniel stood abruptly and walked toward the window, his back to her. Outside, the street was dark and empty. She never told me that, he said. She tried, Miriam replied, in the ways she knew how. Daniel closed his eyes. When Miriam left, the house felt smaller than ever. The journal returned to him again and again over the following weeks. He read it in pieces, never all at once, as though spacing the pain might somehow make it manageable. Near the middle, one entry stopped him cold. There is something I need to tell Daniel. I keep putting it off because I don't want to hurt him, but secrets don't heal anything. They only rot. Daniel stared at the page, his pulse quickening. The following pages were blank. His breath shallow, he flipped forward. More blank pages. Then toward the end of the journal, another entry appeared, dated just days before her death. I will tell him soon, even if it costs us peace for a while. Truth is better than silence. Daniel closed the journal slowly. A cold realization settled over him. Rebecca had been carrying something alone, something important enough to delay, something heavy enough to fear. And now, whatever it was, it would never be spoken. The thought ignited something sharp and dangerous inside him, not just grief, but anger, at himself, at Rebecca, at God. If you knew, he said aloud, pacing the living room, why didn't you give us time? The question hung in the air, unanswered. For the first time, the possibility that God's silence was not accidental began to feel intolerable. Daniel slammed the journal shut and shoved it into a drawer. He could not carry this on top of everything else. And yet, he knew he would. Because silence, once learned, is difficult to unlearn. As night settled in, Daniel sat alone in the dim living room, the cross on the wall casting a long shadow. Something inside him had shifted again, not toward healing but toward fracture. The faith he had once inherited without question was now splintering under the weight of unanswered prayers, unspoken truths, and a guilt that refused to loosen its grip. And beneath it all, a quiet, relentless thought continued to surface, uninvited, unresolved. If God knew and still waited, then what does that say about him? The question did not seek an answer yet, but it was learning how to stay. Winter arrived without ceremony. There was no first snowfall worth remembering, no cinematic shift in the sky, just colder mornings, longer nights, and a heaviness that settled into Daniel's bones as if the season had been waiting for permission. He stopped marking time. Days blended together until he could no longer say whether something had happened yesterday or 3 weeks ago. Work continued because it had to. Conversations occurred because silence made other people uncomfortable. Life moved forward around him, indifferent to his refusal to follow. Inside, Daniel felt suspended, caught between a past that would not release him and a future he no longer trusted. Prayer was the first thing to disappear. Not all at once, not dramatically. It eroded the way stone erodes underwater, slow, quiet, inevitable. At first he tried. He stood in the shower and spoke a few words aloud, hoping the steam and white noise might soften the ache. He whispered fragments while driving, short sentences aimed nowhere in particular. Help me get through today. Please, God, I don't know. But every attempt ended the same way, with silence so complete it felt intentional. No peace followed, no comfort settled, no sense of being heard. Eventually, Daniel stopped finishing sentences. Then he stopped starting them. By January, prayer had become something other people did. One night, unable to sleep, Daniel wandered into the spare bedroom, the one that had never quite become an office or a guest room. Rebecca had once suggested turning it into a space for quiet reflection. a place to pray. "We could put a chair by the window," she had said. "Somewhere to breathe." Daniel had agreed distractedly, already thinking about work emails. Now the room was bare, the suggestion unrealized. He stood in the doorway, arms crossed, feeling a flicker of something, regret, irritation, longing. He couldn't tell which. "You wanted this," he said aloud, as if Rebecca might hear him. "You wanted space for God." The word caught in his throat. God. He stepped inside and closed the door. The room smelled faintly of dust and old paint. Moonlight slipped through the blinds, casting narrow stripes across the floor. Daniel lowered himself onto the floor, his back against the wall, knees drawn to his chest. The posture surprised him. It was instinctive, childlike. He rested his forehead against his knees and closed his eyes. Nothing happened. No sense of presence, no warmth, no voice. Just the quiet hum of the house settling around him. "I don't know how to talk to you anymore," he said finally. His voice sounded unfamiliar, stripped of its practiced confidence. "I don't even know if you're there." The words felt dangerous the moment they left his mouth, not because of fear, but because of relief. Saying them aloud loosened something inside him. "If you are," he continued, his tone sharpening, "then you knew what she was carrying. You knew what I was missing, and you still waited." His breathing quickened. "You let her pray herself into exhaustion," he said. "You let her hope I would change, and you let her die before I did." His chest tightened painfully. "That doesn't feel like love." The room did not respond. Daniel laughed once, bitter and hollow. "Of course you won't answer," he said. "You never do when it matters." He stood abruptly, as if ashamed of having tried at all, and left the room without looking back. The journal returned to his thoughts like an unresolved chord. He resisted it for weeks, leaving it buried in the drawer, pretending the unanswered questions didn't pulse beneath the surface of his days. But silence has a way of amplifying what it tries to suppress. One Saturday afternoon, while cleaning the kitchen with mechanical precision, Daniel found himself standing in front of the drawer. His hand hovered, then pulled it open. The journal lay exactly where he had left it. He opened it without sitting down. This time he read from the beginning. Not skimming, not searching, listening. Rebecca's voice emerged slowly, woven through mundane details and quiet confessions. Grocery lists sat beside prayers. Frustrations followed moments of gratitude. She wrote about work, about her sister, about small joys that Daniel realized he had barely noticed. And threaded through it all was a faith that felt painfully sincere. "Lord, I don't want to harden my heart. Help me love Daniel the way you love him, even when I feel unseen." Daniel leaned against the counter, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the edge. "I was right there," he murmured. "I was right there." Near the middle of the journal, he found an entry dated 3 months before her death. "I almost told him tonight. We were sitting on the couch and for a moment it felt safe. But then his phone buzzed and the moment closed again." Daniel closed his eyes. He could see it clearly, the glow of the screen, the reflexive glance, the unspoken message that something else mattered more. The cost of distraction revealed itself slowly, mercilessly. Later that evening, Daniel sat on the living room floor, the journal open in his lap, when a folded piece of paper slipped out from between the pages. He froze. The paper was creased carefully, as if it had been opened and closed many times. His heart pounded as he unfolded it. It was a letter written to him. "Daniel, I don't know if I'll ever have the courage to give this to you, but I need to write it because carrying it alone is becoming too heavy." His breath hitched. "I love you. I've always loved you, but there is something in our marriage that I have been afraid to touch. Not because it isn't real, but because it is." The room seemed to tilt. "Before we met, I made a choice I regret deeply. It didn't seem like it would matter forever. I didn't know it would follow me like this." Daniel's pulse roared in his ears. "I have prayed for forgiveness. I believe God has forgiven me. But I don't know if you could." His hands trembled. "I wanted to tell you sooner. I should have told you sooner. I waited because I was afraid of losing you." The letter ended there. No explanation, no detail, just silence. Daniel stared at the final line until the words blurred. A choice, a secret, something she believed might cost him everything. His mind raced, filling the gaps with possibilities, each one more unsettling than the last. His chest burned with a mix of anger, confusion, and a grief that took on a new, jagged edge. "She let me marry her," he whispered hoarsely, "without telling me." The thought hardened quickly into accusation. She had chosen silence, just like him. The realization struck with brutal clarity. That night, Daniel dreamed again. But this time, the dream did not soften its edges. He stood in a church sanctuary, empty except for Rebecca seated alone in the front row. The lights were dim, the air thick. "Why didn't you tell me?" he demanded. She turned slowly. "I tried," she said. "You were always looking somewhere else." "You took my choice away," he replied. "You let me build a life without the truth." She stood and walked toward him, stopping just short of touching distance. "And you let me carry the weight of loving you alone," she said quietly. Daniel woke with his heart racing, his body slick with sweat. For the first time, anger toward Rebecca outweighed his sorrow. And beneath that anger, something darker took shape. If God had forgiven her, if God had known all along, then God had been complicit in the silence too. The thought felt treasonous. It also felt honest. Daniel's faith did not collapse in a single moment. It fractured. Hairline cracks spread slowly, invisibly, until one day he realized he was standing on something that could no longer bear his weight. He stopped wearing his wedding ring. He stopped avoiding church, not by returning, but by refusing to think about it at all. He stopped expecting anything from God. And yet late at night, when the house pressed in around him, a question returned again and again, refusing to be silenced. What if the truth Rebecca carried wasn't the end of the story, but the beginning of something I was never meant to face alone? Daniel did not yet know that the silence he resented was not absence, it was restraint, and that the faith he believed he had lost was not gone, only waiting to be rebuilt on something far more costly than certainty. Daniel stopped wearing his wedding ring in early February. It was not a conscious decision. One morning, while standing at the bathroom sink, he removed it to wash his hands and set it on the counter. The metal clicked softly against the porcelain. When he finished, he dried his hands, stared at his reflection for a moment. The ring stayed there all that evening. As he passed the bathroom, he noticed it again. Small, circular, accuser. Something about its weight, fell knowing, real knowing, changes things. It sharpens memory. It rearranges the past. Daniel found himself replaying old conversations, gestures, silences, scanning them for signs he had missed. Every laugh felt suspect. Every affectionate moment now. Had she already been carrying the seeker? He wanted clarity, he wanted details, he wanted summit. But Rebecca had left him only fragment. The letter burned in his pocket during the day, its presence a constant reminder that truth, once uncovered, rarely arrives whole. It comes in peace. Daniel began avoiding people, not deliberately at first. He stopped returning messages. He declined invitations. He chose empty grocery store aisles and late-night hours. It was easier to be alone than to answer questions he didn't know how to articulate. "How are you holding up? Are you doing okay? Let me know if you need anything." He needed everything. He asked for nothing. At work, he functioned, competently, efficiently. He buried himself in tasks, letting deadlines replace grief. Productivity became a refuge, structured, predictable, emotionally sterile. But even there, the cracks followed him. One afternoon, during a meeting he barely registered, a colleague mentioned forgiveness. The word landed heavily, unexpected. Daniel's jaw tightened. Forgiveness. The concept felt premature, offensive even. How could forgiveness exist without full truth, without consequence, without confrontation? That evening, unable to tolerate the walls of his house, Daniel drove aimlessly until he found himself parked outside the church he had once attended faithfully. The building looked unchanged, familiar. Warm light spilled from the windows and cars lined the parking lot, a midweek service. For a moment, he considered leaving. Instead, he stayed in the car, engine off, hands resting on the steering wheel. He watched people enter, couples, families, individuals greeting one another with easy familiarity. Laughter drifted faintly through the glass. It felt like another lifetime. A phrase surfaced in his mind, uninvited. They don't know what you know. The thought made him feel both isolated and superior, and he hated himself for it. He leaned his head back against the seat and closed his eyes. "I don't belong there anymore," he said quietly. The admission felt final. The letter became his private interrogation. Late at night, Daniel unfolded it again and again, tracing Rebecca's handwriting as if the pressure of the pen might reveal what the words withheld. "A choice I regret deeply." The phrase echoed. His mind cycled through possibilities, each one eroding trust in a different way. Had she betrayed him? Had there been someone else? Had she lied about something foundational to their life together? Every scenario carried its own version of loss. What angered him most was not the secret itself, but the timing of its revelation. Truth delivered after death demanded response without allowing resolution. It demanded forgiveness without offering dialogue. "You don't get to ask that of me," Daniel said aloud one night, his voice sharp in the empty living room. "You don't get to leave and still expect grace." The words lingered. Grace. He laughed bitterly. Grace was easy when people stayed, when apologies could be spoken, when repentance could be seen. Grace after silence felt like cruelty. And yet, beneath his anger, something quieter stirred. An uncomfortable awareness that his refusal to forgive mirrored the very silence he resented. The thought infuriated him. Miriam called again in March. He almost didn't answer. "Daniel," she said when he finally did, her voice tentative. "I've been meaning to ask, have you been reading Rebecca's journal?" There was a pause on the line. "Yes," he said. Another pause. He could hear her breathing. "There's something you should know," she said carefully. "About the letter." Daniel's grip tightened around the phone. "What letter?" he asked, though he already knew. Miriam exhaled slowly. "She told me she had written it," she said. "She didn't tell me what was in it, just that it scared her, and that she hoped one day you'd understand." "Understand what?" Daniel snapped. "I don't know," Miriam replied, her voice steady but strained. "But I know she believed you were capable of forgiveness, even if it hurt." Daniel closed his eyes. "Did God tell her that too?" he asked, the bitterness slipping through. Miriam did not answer immediately. "She believed God cared more about truth than comfort," she said at last, "even when truth cost something." The words landed with uncomfortable precision. After the call ended, Daniel sat in silence for a long time. Truth over comfort. The principle sounded noble in sermons, abstract, manageable. Living it was something else entirely. That night, Daniel did something he had not done in months. He knelt. The movement felt awkward, foreign, as though his body remembered something his heart had forgotten. His knees pressed into the carpet, his hands rested loosely in his lap. He did not bow his head. He stared at the wall. "I don't want to forgive her," he said quietly. "I don't even know what I'd be forgiving." His voice trembled, not with fear, but with exhaustion. "And I don't want to forgive you either," he added, "because you could have stopped this. You could have made her speak. You could have made me listen." Silence answered him again, but this time it felt different, not empty, restrained. Daniel swallowed. "If forgiveness is obedience," he continued, his tone raw, "then I don't want to obey. Not like this, not without answers." He waited, expecting guilt or pressure or some internal correction. Instead, something unexpected surfaced. A memory. Rebecca sitting on the edge of the couch, journal in her lap, her expression careful, hopeful, afraid. "Truth is better than silence." The phrase echoed again, but this time it did not accuse, it invited. Daniel's breath shuddered. "I don't know how to do this," he whispered. The admission felt dangerous, vulnerable, and for the first time in a long while, it felt like prayer. In the days that followed, Daniel noticed small disruptions to his carefully constructed detachment. He dreamed less violently, slept slightly longer. The house felt marginally less oppressive at night. Nothing dramatic changed, but something had shifted. The anger was still there, the grief still sharp, the questions still unanswered. Yet beneath them, a quieter awareness emerged, one he resisted but could not fully silence. Knowing the truth was not the same as being destroyed by it, and forgiveness, whatever it might look like, would not erase the past. It would only determine whether the past continued to rule him. One evening, Daniel placed the letter back inside the journal and closed it gently, as though the act itself were a form of respect. He did not forgive Rebecca that night. He did not forgive God. But for the first time, he stopped insisting that forgiveness was impossible, and somewhere deep within the quiet he had learned to resent, the question began to change. Not why did this happen, but something far more unsettling. What will I do with the truth now that I have it? The answer did not come, not yet. But the silence, once an enemy, was beginning to sound like something else, like waiting. Spring arrived reluctantly, as if the world itself were unsure whether renewal was appropriate. The trees outside Daniel's house showed only the faintest signs of change, small buds, tentative and fragile, clinging to branches still hardened by winter. The air warmed inconsistently, one day hopeful, the next withdrawn. It mirrored him too closely to be comforting. Daniel had stopped arguing with God out loud, not because the anger had faded, but because he had learned that shouting into silence exhausted him faster than it relieved him. Instead, the resentment settled inward, quieter but no less heavy. Forgiveness lingered in his thoughts like a word in a foreign language, recognizable, impossible to pronounce. He carried the journal with him now, not everywhere but often. It stayed in his briefcase at work, tucked between files and reports, an artifact of a life that refused to remain compartmentalized. Some afternoons, he found himself opening it without reading, just letting his fingers rest on the pages as though proximity might translate into understanding. It never did. The first real crack in his isolation came from an unexpected place. One Tuesday evening, Daniel received an email from the church, one he had forgotten he was still subscribed to. He almost deleted it without opening. Habit stopped him. Grief support group. Wednesdays at 7 p.m., he scoffed quietly. Group grief had always struck him as performative. Too many words, too much vulnerability in rooms that did not deserve it. Still, the idea lingered longer than it should have. By Wednesday evening, he found himself standing outside the church again, the building unchanged, the parking lot half full. He remained in his car for several minutes, the engine idling, his pulse steady but heavy. "This is stupid," he muttered. He turned the engine off anyway. The room was small, intentionally so. Folding chairs arranged in a circle, a box of tissues placed conspicuously in the center, as if acknowledging inevitability. Daniel chose a chair near the door. There were 7 others, different ages, different losses. The air held a collective restraint, the quiet tension of people unsure how much of themselves to reveal. A woman facilitated the group, calm, unassuming. "We don't fix grief here," she said gently. "We witness it." Daniel crossed his arms. People spoke, one by one. Stories unfolded: husbands, wives, children, parents, cancer, accidents, sudden absences, long declines. Daniel listened without comment. Then a man across the circle spoke. "My wife died 5 years ago," he said, his voice steady but worn. "And I hated God for a long time." Daniel's attention sharpened. "I didn't stop believing," the man continued. "I just stopped trusting." The words struck cleanly, without flourish. "That was harder to admit than doubt," he added. Daniel felt something shift, subtle but undeniable. When it was his turn, he shook his head. "I'll pass," he said. No one pushed. As the meeting ended, the man approached him quietly. "Daniel," he said, reading the name tag. "I'm Thomas." Daniel nodded. "You don't owe anyone your story," Thomas said, "but if you ever decide to tell it, don't rush forgiveness. It doesn't like to be forced." Daniel held his gaze. "Did you forgive?" he asked. Thomas paused. "I'm learning," he replied. "That's different." The following weeks unfolded with an unfamiliar rhythm. Daniel attended the group again and again. Sometimes he spoke, often he didn't. Listening became its own form of participation. Hearing others articulate pain he had buried gave his own grief permission to exist without explanation. One evening, without intending to, Daniel spoke about the letter, not its contents, just its existence. "A truth revealed too late," he said quietly. "A forgiveness demanded without conversation." The room was still. "That's a hard mercy," the facilitator said gently. "Hard mercy." The phrase lodged itself in Daniel's chest. That night, alone in his living room, Daniel opened the journal again, turning slowly to the final entries. He read Rebecca's words with less accusation now, more restraint. She had not written from cruelty. She had written from fear. The realization unsettled him. Fear did not excuse silence, but it explained it. And explanation, he was learning, was not the same as absolution. One afternoon, Daniel visited Miriam. They sat at her kitchen table, the window open, sunlight spilling across the surface. It felt strange to be there, to exist in a space where Rebecca had once belonged. "I found the letter," he said finally. Miriam nodded. "I wondered when you would." "I don't know what to do with it," he admitted. She considered him carefully. "Rebecca believed forgiveness was a process," she said, "not a moment." Daniel exhaled slowly. "I don't know if I can forgive someone who isn't here," he said. Miriam's eyes softened. "Then start with forgiving the version of her you never allowed to be afraid," she replied. The words settled deeply. That night, Daniel returned to the spare bedroom. The room no longer felt accusatory, just unfinished. He brought in a chair and placed it by the window. He sat. The silence remained, but it no longer felt hostile. "I'm not ready," he said quietly, "but I'm willing to be willing." The phrase surprised him. He waited. No answer came, yet something eased. The work of mercy, he realized, was not loud. It did not announce itself. It unfolded slowly, in choices made without certainty. Forgiveness was not forgetting. It was refusing to let the wound decide who he would become. As Daniel sat there, the night pressing gently against the glass, he did not feel restored. But for the first time since Rebecca's death, he felt engaged, alive to the struggle. And somewhere beneath the grief, beneath the questions that still ached for resolution, a fragile truth began to take root. grace was not arriving to erase the past. It was arriving to teach him how to live with it without being destroyed. The silence did not break, but it no longer felt empty. It felt attentive, and that unsettled him more than anger ever had. The call came on an ordinary Thursday. That was what unsettled Daniel most. Not the timing, not the number flashing on his screen, but the ordinariness of it. The world had not paused to announce significance. The sky outside his office window was pale and unremarkable. Emails waited unanswered. A meeting reminder blinked quietly in the corner of his monitor. The phone vibrated once. Unknown number. He almost ignored it. Almost. Something, intuition, restlessness, or the slow erosion of avoidance, made him answer. Daniel Carter? Yes. This is Pastor Elias from Mercy Outreach Center. Daniel frowned. The name stirred faint recognition. A smaller church, community work. Rebecca had mentioned it once or twice, usually in passing, usually after volunteering. Yes, Daniel replied cautiously. How can I help you? There was a brief pause, the kind that suggested careful wording. I'm calling because your wife, Rebecca, used to meet with me, occasionally. Not for counseling exactly, more for conversation. Daniel's throat tightened. She spoke about you, Elias continued, about your marriage, about her faith, and about a matter she intended to address. The room seemed to narrow. I found a note she left here, the pastor said gently. It was meant for you. She asked that I give it to you if she didn't have the chance herself. Daniel closed his eyes. I already found a letter, he said, his voice controlled but strained. It didn't explain anything. I know, Elias replied. This one doesn't either. Not fully, but it may help. Silence stretched between them. Would you be willing to come by? The pastor asked. Daniel hesitated. Every instinct urged him to refuse, to protect what little equilibrium he had managed to assemble, to keep the past contained. Yes, he said. The word surprised him. The Mercy Outreach Center sat on the edge of the city, modest and unassuming. Brick walls, a faded sign, no grandeur, no stained glass. Daniel parked and remained in the car for several minutes, his hands resting motionless on the steering wheel. He felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the prelude to retreat. Just listen, he told himself. You don't have to agree, or forgive, or understand. Just listen. Inside, the building smelled faintly of coffee and paper. Pastor Elias greeted him warmly, without urgency, without expectation. They sat in a small office, 2 chairs, a desk cluttered with notebooks, a single framed verse on the wall. Truth spoken in love brings freedom. Daniel looked away. Elias handed him an envelope. Plain, unmarked. She left this here months ago, he said. After a long conversation, she was afraid, but resolved. Daniel did not open it immediately. What was the conversation about? He asked. Elias folded his hands. She came because she believed silence was damaging her soul, he said. Not just your marriage, herself. Daniel swallowed. She told me she had made a decision before you met, Elias continued, one that shaped how she saw herself and how she believed others might see her if they knew. Daniel's pulse quickened. She wasn't hiding from consequences, Elias added. She was hiding from rejection. The words landed with unexpected force. Daniel looked down at the envelope. Why didn't she tell me? He asked quietly. Elias did not answer immediately. Because fear doesn't obey logic, he said at last. And because she believed, wrongly I think, that love required perfection. Daniel exhaled slowly. He opened the envelope. Inside was a single page, Rebecca's handwriting. Daniel, if you are reading this, then I waited too long. I'm sorry for that. His breath caught. I need you to know something clearly. What I kept from you was not betrayal. It was not infidelity. It was not dishonesty about loving you. Daniel's shoulders sagged, tension releasing he had not known he was carrying. Before I met you, I was pregnant. I was young, afraid, alone. I made a decision I will carry with me for the rest of my life. Daniel's vision blurred. I asked God to forgive me. I believe he did. But I never believed I deserved your mercy too. The room felt suddenly too quiet. I didn't tell you because I was afraid that knowing me fully would make you leave. I thought loving you silently was better than losing you honestly. Daniel lowered the letter, his hands trembling. The truth settled heavily, not as shock but as sorrow. She had not betrayed him, she had been afraid of him, and the realization cut deeper than anger ever had. Daniel did not speak for a long time. Elias remained still, offering presence rather than explanation. I would have stayed, Daniel said finally, his voice breaking. I would have stayed. Elias nodded gently. I believe that, he said. Daniel pressed the letter to his chest, his breathing uneven. I made her afraid, he whispered. Not intentionally, but consistently. The confession rose unbidden, raw and unfiltered. The room seemed to hold it carefully. She didn't trust my grace, Daniel continued, because I hadn't shown her enough of it. Elias spoke softly. Forgiveness isn't only about absolving wrong, he said. Sometimes it's about mourning the safety we failed to create. Daniel closed his eyes. The words echoed painfully. That night, Daniel returned home carrying more than a letter. He carried clarity, and clarity, he was learning, demanded response. He sat in the spare room, the chair by the window, familiar now. He placed the letter and the journal on the floor in front of him. For a long time, he said nothing. Then, quietly, without ceremony, he spoke. I'm sorry. The words were not directed upward. They were spoken into the room, into the memory of a woman who had loved him while fearing his distance. I would have stayed, he repeated. I wish I had shown you that. Tears came freely now, not sharp, not panicked, but deep and cleansing. They fell without resistance, and for the first time in months, Daniel prayed without accusation, not for answers, not for relief, for mercy. Teach me how to forgive without needing to rewrite the past, he whispered. Teach me how to live with truth without hardening. The silence remained, but something else joined it. A quiet, steady conviction, not condemning, not dramatic. This is the cost of love. And this is where healing begins. Daniel stayed there until the night deepened, until the city outside grew still. The past had spoken back, not to destroy him, but to invite him into a deeper reckoning, one that would not only change how he remembered Rebecca, but how he would choose to love from this moment forward. Daniel did not wake the next morning with clarity. There was no sudden peace, no internal resolution, no sense that the hardest part was behind him. What he woke with was weight. The truth Rebecca had carried now lived with him, and it did not settle gently. It pressed against his chest as he lay in bed, the letter replaying itself in fragments. Each sentence echoed with new meaning, not accusatory, but demanding presence. I never believed I deserved your mercy too. That line stayed. It followed him into the shower, where the water ran hot enough to redden his skin. It followed him as he dressed, as he poured coffee he barely tasted, as he stood by the window watching morning traffic move with quiet insistence. Mercy. The word no longer felt abstract. It felt personal and costly. Daniel returned to work, but his focus fractured easily. He caught himself staring at documents without absorbing them, his mind drifting toward moments that now demanded reinterpretation. Rebecca's hesitation before certain conversations, her careful phrasing, the way she sometimes searched his face before speaking, as if gauging safety rather than affection. He had mistaken restraint for peace. At lunch, he sat alone in his car, the letter folded neatly in his jacket pocket. He took it out and read it again, not to search for more, but to accept what was there. She had not asked him to agree with her past. She had asked him to see her fully, and he had not. That realization did not lead him to self-loathing. It led him somewhere more dangerous: responsibility. That evening, Daniel returned to the grief support group. He had not planned to speak. But when Thomas shared again, quietly, honestly, about learning how to forgive a version of his wife that existed only in memory, something loosened inside Daniel. When his turn came, he did not deflect. "My wife was afraid of me," he said simply. The room stilled. "Not because I was cruel," he continued, choosing his words carefully, "but because I wasn't safe enough. I loved her. I provided. I stayed faithful, but I didn't stay present." No one interrupted. "I thought forgiveness was something I needed to give," Daniel said. "Now I realize it's also something I needed to become." Thomas nodded slowly. "That takes longer," he said. "Yes," Daniel replied, "and it hurts differently." Daniel began writing again. Not journaling, he had never been good at that, but letters. Unsigned, unsent. He wrote to Rebecca first. He wrote what he wished he had said before silence replaced opportunity. He wrote apologies that did not seek response. He wrote acknowledgments without defense. "I didn't protect your vulnerability. I loved you, but I didn't always choose you. I thought being reliable was the same as being present." He folded the pages carefully and placed them inside the journal, not as correction, but as witness. Then he wrote to God. The letters were shorter, less articulate, more restrained. "I am afraid of trusting you again, not because you failed me, but because I see now how much trust costs." He did not ask for reassurance. He asked for endurance. In the weeks that followed, Daniel noticed a subtle shift in how he responded to others. He listened longer, interrupted less. When conversations grew uncomfortable, he resisted the urge to escape them with efficiency or humor. Presence, he was learning, was not passive. It required attention, slowness, risk. One afternoon, Miriam invited him to coffee. They sat across from one another, sunlight catching in the steam rising from their cups. "She would be relieved," Miriam said, after he told her about the letter from Pastor Elias. "Not that you know, but that you're still here." Daniel nodded. "I wish she had trusted me sooner," he said. Miriam considered him carefully. "I wish she had trusted herself sooner," she replied. "But fear doesn't follow our wishes." Daniel looked down. "I don't want to become someone who only learns after loss," he said. Miriam's voice softened. "Then don't," she said. "Stay now, with what's left." The words stayed with him. That night, Daniel returned to the spare room. The chair by the window had become familiar, almost sacred, not because of what happened there, but because of what did not. No visions, no voices, no absolution, just truth. He sat quietly, the city lights flickering below, and allowed himself to speak honestly. "I'm learning how to stay," he said. "Not fix, not solve, stay." The silence did not answer, but it did not withdraw either. And for the first time, Daniel understood something he had resisted for months. Faith was not returning as certainty. It was returning as commitment. Commitment to remain open when withdrawal felt safer. Commitment to love without guarantees. Commitment to let mercy change him, even when it exposed his limitations. Grace, he realized, was not arriving to console him, It was arriving to reshape him. As he sat there, the letter folded beside him, Daniel did not feel whole, but he felt oriented, facing forward. And that, quietly, was enough to keep going. The changes in Daniel's life did not announce themselves. They arrived quietly, without urgency or spectacle, like light entering a room through a crack no one noticed had widened. If anyone had asked him when healing began, he would not have known how to answer. Healing, he was learning, rarely respects calendars. It reveals itself in response, in the way a man chooses to remain instead of retreat, in the way silence becomes inhabited rather than empty, in the way the past stops demanding punishment and begins asking for stewardship. Daniel still carried grief. Some mornings it greeted him before his feet touched the floor. Other days it waited patiently until nightfall, but it no longer dictated his posture toward the world. It walked with him now, instead of dragging him. One Sunday morning in early summer, Daniel returned to church. Not the large one he had once attended, and not with intention or resolve. He found himself standing outside Mercy Outreach Center, dressed plainly, unsure why he was there at all. The door was open. Inside, the sanctuary was modest. Rows of simple chairs, light filtering through clear windows, no grandeur to hide behind. A small group had gathered. Children fidgeted. Older couples sat close together, their shoulders touching with the ease of familiarity. Daniel took a seat near the back. The service unfolded without drama. No emotional crescendos, no polished performance. The pastor spoke about restoration, not as return to former glory, but as faithful rebuilding with different materials. What God restores, Elias said gently, is not always what we lost. Sometimes it is what we never knew how to build. The word settled deeply. Communion followed. Daniel hesitated when the bread and cup were passed. His hands remained still in his lap. He watched others partake, quietly, reverently, until Elias's voice reached him again. "This table," the pastor said, "is for those who are learning to trust grace more than certainty." Daniel's hands moved before his mind caught up. The bread was dry, the cup bitter. He welcomed both. Later that week, Daniel volunteered at the outreach center. He did not sign up for anything meaningful. He stacked chairs, washed dishes, listened. An older man named Samuel spoke about losing his daughter years earlier. A young woman named Leah asked for help finding work. A boy sat silently at a table, drawing with fierce concentration. Daniel noticed how easily pain surfaced in that space, unhidden, unashamed. He realized, with a quiet ache, that Rebecca had loved places like this because they did not require perfection, only presence. He stayed late. When he finally left, he felt tired in a way that felt earned. That night, Daniel dreamed of Rebecca again, but this time she was not distant. They sat on a park bench, sunlight filtering through leaves above them. She looked at him, not cautiously, not with fear, but openly. "You stayed," she said. He wanted to answer, to explain, to apologize again, but she smiled gently and stood. The dream ended there. Daniel woke with tears on his face and an unfamiliar calm in his chest. The grief remained, but it no longer accused him. The work of restoration continued in small, deliberate acts. Daniel reached out to people he had neglected. He apologized without justification. He listened without rushing resolution. He learned to sit with discomfort rather than correct it. And slowly, without fanfare, faith returned, not as certainty, not as explanation, but as trust, practiced daily. One evening, as Daniel sat in the spare room, the chair by the window creaking softly beneath him, he realized something had changed. He was no longer asking God to fix the past. He was asking to be faithful with the present. "Thank you," he said quietly. The words were not dramatic. They were sufficient. In the months that followed, Others noticed the change before Daniel did. Miriam commented on it first. "You're different," she said over dinner one night. "Not lighter, deeper." Daniel considered her words. "I think I stopped trying to survive my grief," he replied, "and started letting it teach me." She smiled. Rebecca would have liked that, he thought. On the anniversary of Rebecca's death, Daniel returned to the place where everything had fractured. He stood by the roadside where the accident had occurred. Traffic moved past steadily, indifferent and loud. The world, as always, continued. Daniel placed the journal on the hood of his car and rested his hand on it. "I forgive you," he said, "not as command, not as performance, but as release." And then, after a pause, "I forgive myself." The words did not erase pain, but they changed its weight. Daniel stayed there for a long time, the wind brushing past him, the noise fading into the background. He did not ask why anymore. He asked how to live gently, how to love attentively, how to remain when silence returned. As he drove away, something settled in him, not triumph, not resolution, but peace, quiet, grounded, earned. The story of his faith was no longer about what he had lost. It was about what had been restored, slowly, quietly, and with mercy that had reshaped him from the inside out. And though he did not yet know what the future would ask of him, Daniel knew this. He would stay, even when it was costly, especially then. The last season arrived without warning. Daniel did not recognize it at first, not as an ending, not as resolution. It felt less like arrival and more like settling, the way dust eventually comes to rest after a long disturbance. Life did not announce that something was complete. It simply began asking different things of him. He noticed it in the mornings. The house still held absence, but it no longer echoed. Silence had lost its sharp edges. It had become a companion, sometimes heavy, sometimes generous, always honest. Daniel woke earlier now, not out of restlessness but intention. He drank his coffee slowly, seated at the table Rebecca had once complained he never used. Sunlight filtered in through the window, illuminating ordinary details. The grain of the wood, the faint crack along the wall, the quiet dignity of a space lived in fully again. Grief still visited, but it no longer demanded control. The invitation came from Mercy Outreach Center in late autumn. A small gathering, nothing ceremonial. Pastor Elias had asked Daniel to speak, not to teach, not to preach, but to tell a story. His story. Daniel had resisted at first. "I'm not finished," he said. Elias had smiled gently. "No one ever is," he replied. "That's why testimony matters." On the evening of the gathering, Daniel stood at the front of the modest room, hands resting loosely at his sides. The faces before him were familiar now, people marked by loss, quiet endurance, fragile hope. He did not rehearse, he spoke plainly. "I lost my wife," he said, "and with her, I lost the version of faith I thought I needed." The room remained still. "I believed faith was certainty," he continued, "that if I trusted God enough, nothing essential would be taken from me. I was wrong." He paused. "What remained was not answers," Daniel said. "What remained was grace, quiet, unforced, patient. Grace that did not explain my pain, but stayed with me in it." He spoke of silence, of fear, of truth revealed too late, of forgiveness that arrived slowly and demanded humility instead of heroism. "I learned that God was not absent," he said finally. "He was restrained, allowing me to see myself clearly and to choose who I would become after loss." No one applauded. They did not need to. Afterward, a young man approached him. "My father died last year," he said softly. "I stopped praying because it felt pointless." Daniel nodded. "I stopped too," he replied. "Then I learned that prayer doesn't always change circumstances. Sometimes it changes who remains. The young man held his gaze, absorbing the words. "Does the pain ever go away?" he asked. Daniel considered carefully. "No," he said, "but it stops being the loudest voice in the room." The young man nodded, as if that were enough, and perhaps it was. That night, Daniel returned home and opened the journal one last time. He did not read it. He placed it gently in a box alongside the letters he had written, his words resting beside hers, not in correction, not in completion, but in companionship. He closed the lid. Some stories, he understood now, do not need to be revisited endlessly to be honored. They need to be lived forward. In the weeks that followed, Daniel continued serving quietly. He did not seek leadership. He did not chase meaning. He remained attentive, present to conversations, to pain, to moments that required patience rather than solutions. Faith, once loud and declarative, had become practiced. It looked like staying when withdrawal was easier, like listening without fixing, like forgiving without demanding repayment. It looked like mercy embodied. On a cold evening, nearly a year after Rebecca's death, Daniel returned to the spare room one final time. The chair by the window remained. The city lights shimmered beyond the glass. He sat. He did not ask for anything. He did not explain himself. He simply spoke. "I'm here." The words carried no expectation. They did not need to. The silence answered, not with sound, but with presence. And Daniel understood at last the lesson that had been forming slowly through grief, truth, forgiveness, and restoration. God had not promised him a life untouched by loss. He had promised him a presence that would not leave when loss arrived. Daniel remained seated until the night deepened, until the world outside grew quiet, until his breathing slowed into something like peace. What remained was not the life he had planned. It was the life he had been given. And it was enough, not because it was easy, but because it was held by grace that did not rush him, mercy that did not shame him, and a faith no longer built on certainty, but on love that stayed. When Daniel finally stood and turned off the light, he did so without urgency. Tomorrow would come, and he would meet it, present, forgiven, restored.